one of the key attractions for many employees is the lack of income tax at the moment. So understanding what other benefits within the kind of remuneration structure there are, in addition to basic salary.
You're listening to the Global Workforce Podcast with me, George Britton. Each week, we interview an industry expert to dive deeper into the world of managing a global workforce and discuss the big strategic challenges that you're going to encounter along the way. This episode is brought to you by Omnipresent, the global employment platform that allows you to employ anyone, anywhere without having to set up an entity. Designed, built, and supported by global employment experts, Omnipresent takes care of your international employees and contractors, so you don't have to worry about payroll, HR, or compliance issues, making it easier, faster, and safer to expand internationally. My guest today is Aryeetey. Emily is a senior employment lawyer who plays a central role in Stephenson Harwood's Middle East employment team. With over 10 years of international experience, she advises employers across the entire employment lifecycle, including recruitment, termination, data protection, and corporate transactions, as well as the employment aspects of corporate transactions, mergers, acquisitions, outsourcing, and IPOs. Emily regularly advises on and manages multi-jurisdictional employment matters throughout the Middle East and Africa and beyond. For example, in recent years, she's advised on matters in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, Iraq, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Ivory Coast, Algeria, and I'm sure many other countries as well. Emily is widely regarded as one of the leading employment practitioners in the Middle East region and is ranked by Chambers and Partners Global 2024 UAE as an up-and-coming partner for employment and next generation partner within the Legal 500 EMEA 2024 Guide UAE. Emily, I'm really excited to have you on the podcast to talk about all things UAE today.
I'm excited to be on. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. So Emily, you're one of Stephenson Harwood's resident experts in the UAE, but before that you've trained in the UK. Can you share a few insights about what makes the UAE unique as an employment market? What do companies growing their workforce in this region need to know?
Yes, that's right. I trained and qualified in the UK, practiced there for about 7 years before I came to the UAE. And that move is still it's still in my mind, some of the key things that jump out at you when you do move over. I would say that as a specialist in the UK and having had experience, it's been really useful to draw upon some of that to fill or rather deal with some of the gaps that you might feel you encounter here in the UAE when you're trying to provide kind of practical employment law advice and commercial advice, particularly to companies that have been headquartered or are used to operating in regions where there's a much more established employment law or practices. And kind of with that, I would flag that, as coming to the Middle East, it really struck me just how much personal and professional connections are given high importance. And I think that really gives it a really dynamic, relationship-driven environment or place to do business and very attractive for kind of entrepreneurial individuals and companies. And there's no surprise that it continues to be a fairly attractive place for employees who want to work here. And on that, I think the market does have some unique aspects to it. The number one is the legal framework. You've got multiple jurisdictions at play in the UAE. You've got federal labour law, which I suppose governs most private sector employment at a federal level. But then you've also got these commercial free zone areas. And within those free zone areas, there are two free zone areas which are dedicated financial free zone areas. So one's called the Dubai International Financial Centre, the DIFC, and then you have the Abu Dhabi Global Market in Abu Dhabi, or known as ADGM. And each of these locations have their own employment regulations. So businesses moving here need to be clear on, first of all, where is your business going to be based? And which of those rules apply to your business and your employees. And that's going to be fundamental so that you get your documentation, work payment permits, visas, and so on correct when you're trying to get those in place. And I think on that same vein, speaking of visas, work permits, visas are pretty essential in the UAE. That's not to say you don't need to deal with immigration in other jurisdictions, but in the UAE, you've got such a large proportion of the workforce of the private sector is expatriate. And so what you'll find is the visa process is pretty integral to employment, onboarding, and recruitment, and something that is crucial to build into your recruitment timescales. And that itself then leads into or lends itself to pretty diverse workforce here. I come from London, and that's obviously a clearly metropolitan centre. But I think the diversity of the workforce in UAE is pretty distinctive, and it does draw talent from across the world. And that diversity is a huge asset, but it's also something that companies and HR need to manage in terms of ensuring you've got kind of sensitivity built into how you manage those multicultural teams. And aligned with that is also understanding the local policy here around Emiratisation, which is a policy that's aimed at promoting the hiring and participation in the workforce of local UAE nationals, so citizens in the private sector, and understanding that companies will have quotas and incentives to ensure that they're meeting those policies and rules and actually are quite essential for local compliance if you're operating here. And just kind of the wrapper around that is, I think I would emphasize a kind of understanding of cultural considerations here, um, particularly understanding how Islamic traditions and local customs do shape work life, whether in some locations that may be dress codes, but also in terms of understanding and observing religious holidays and other observances like the holy month of Ramadan, and just understanding that how these elements all have to be taken into account to maintain a compliant, but also a respectful and inclusive workplace if you're going to be operating here.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think there's so many different topics you've just kind of started to touch on there. There's so much we can unpack here. As you know, I actually did my first proper trip to Dubai not long ago, a couple of months ago, and I think I saw firsthand some of the things you mentioned there. It's so multicultural over there. There's so many different expats and people from different countries, and I think you can that then
Yeah,
has you need to have that, as you mentioned, like that unique piece about work permits is so different there compared to lots of other countries in the world, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think it's worth mentioning as well that the UAE is just one component of a much wider Middle East market. So I guess as a follow-up to my first question, how do you find the UAE differs from some of the regional neighbors? Are there any trends or characteristics that jump out at you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly similarities culturally, but also there are some fairly unique factors that make the UAE stand out in the region. Um, I think as a kind of central theme, I touched on it just now, is the movement towards enforcing greater workforce nationalisation across certainly across the countries of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, um, which is this policy to integrate um, in a more systematic way um, local nationals into the private sector. Um, and that's certainly something that you see right from whether it's UAE, Saudi, Bahrain, Qatar. There have been increasing initiatives um, in this vein in recent months and years. Um, that being said, there are some differences, and I think economic difference is one, and the diversification in the UAE. I think that's probably the big one. I think the UAE has probably led the way in moving beyond oil and gas um, as a sector focus, and focusing heavily on some other areas like tourism, clearly financial, tech, particularly in cities like Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And, other countries in the region are certainly diversifying, like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. But I think the UAE is probably some way ahead still in having established itself as a real global business and tourism hub. Um, and yes, the other locations are growing on the tourism front, but I think Dubai is still some way ahead in terms of that scale and the appeal. Um, Bring it back to employment, I think the labour market difference is also quite notable. Um, I've talked about nationalisation, workforce nationalisation, um, and whilst you've got these measures, there's still quite a big expatriate workforce, particularly in the UAE, and I think much more so than in other GCC countries. Um, I think the UAE probably more so than the others continues to attract a very international talent pool, and I think that stands out. On the regulatory side, you've kind of got the UAE is having this business friendly reputation. I talked about free zones. You've got this extensive network of free zones offering attractive incentive for foreign investors. And again, yes, there are financial free zones, particularly in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. But I think the UAE has 45 to 50, and that kind of flexibility is probably keeping it as a top choice for international businesses. And that's probably also impacted by the infrastructure here. So if you've ever visited, well, you visited Dubai. So if you've been to Dubai International Airport, it's a world-class airport. Abu Dhabi also has a world-class airport, has world-class ports, and well-established road networks. And I think that probably helps to make it a major global hub, because of the connectivity that is supporting businesses here. And just on the social front, in terms of the cultural transparency or openness, I think the UAE has got a fairly open environment, especially in Dubai. It's known for its extravagances and the vibrant lifestyle, entertainment scene, and it's probably known as being a bit more liberal, shall we say, to some neighbours. Other countries in the region are probably becoming more liberal and gradually opening up, but I think the UAE is really some way down the line on that front, and that's probably helped to attract employees and tourists, of course, to make it such a major destination on both fronts.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, I mean, from an outsider's perspective, it seems like that region, certainly the UAE and Dubai in particular, has grown so much over the last couple of decades, predominantly driven by a lot of expats coming to the space, but highly skilled workers to help develop the economy. And it seems like that's been a real focus for them. It's really interesting then to see how that's impacted, like you say, the culture and that sort of things, but also how there's now this focus on Emiratisation and and that focus on migration as well. It seems really interesting.
Yeah, I think particularly since COVID, I think the pandemic has really, in some ways, accelerated movements out to the UAE, people being more open to working in the Middle East, and obviously the proliferation of different modes of work and remote working. We've definitely seen an influx of people to the region, and Dubai and the UAE more generally in particular.
Yeah, makes sense. I wanted to pick your brains now on some of the differences in, or the variations in, employment law in different regions. So obviously, you've advised on multi-jurisdictional matters throughout Middle East, Africa, lots of different countries that I named at the start. What complexities arise when people are managing employment issues across such diverse legal landscapes?
Well, it can be ridiculously complex because, if you're looking from Middle East to Africa, you've just got a sheer diversity in legal, cultural, regulatory landscapes. So it's an ask to be able to manage all of that without some help. All of the legal frameworks all differ significantly. Each country is going to have its own labour laws. And it's important to know how to stay compliant, um, and understand the varied regulations in each place. And obviously, if you're a company that doesn't have that expertise in house in each of those locations, then it's crucial to partner with local experts who can check the rules, know the rules, whether that's around working hours, termination benefits, onboarding, absences, and typically they will vary pretty widely. I just talked about the workforce nationalisation policies in the GCC. That's something you need to be aware of. And even though that's a kind of common theme within the GCC, each of those countries will have their own rules, which differ, and it's important to understand them to avoid any compliance issues. Um, and I suppose related to that, I think the main issues that tend to come up when we are doing cross-border or international work in the region is understanding the differences in termination arrangements, what's allowed, what's not, what can be settled, or even understanding how dispute resolution processes operate so that you can have a really clear strategy when you're planning or handling a termination. Particularly if there is a fixed time scale as a business, perhaps they need to pivot and move somewhere else, or there's a rationalization of the business locally that you need to spend time to make sure that you can fit that all in, and understanding the payments that become due locally just to minimize any risk of any legal liabilities that could arise by not paying the right things. Um, I think when you're managing employment across such a big area, dual employment is something that's particularly tricky. And this often happens when you've got employees who are working across borders. So, for example, you've got someone living in one country, working there, but are also employed by a company, a subsidiary in another. Um, and potentially you can create tax risks, social security issues, and just labor law, immigration compliance in both locations, depending on the particular arrangement you've got in place. And so we're conscious about advising companies to take care around uh, having employees employed in two locations and making sure that you've properly and clearly defined their obligations and entitlements, or at least understand them as they apply to both or more countries. Um, and I mentioned tax there, and I would typically try to avoid talking about tax where I can. But something that often comes up is this issue around permanent establishment risk, when you've got cross border scenarios. So if an employee's activities in another country is enough to create a taxable presence, that you're then potentially creating tax obligations in another country. Now, there's much more to it than that, but it's just an issue for companies to be aware of, and it does come up when you're looking at operating across the region, and just to be conscious of if you are going to post employees from one place to another.
Yeah, it makes total sense. That sounds like a line you've delivered before, Emily. The taxable presence.
Well worn.
Absolutely. So yeah, you mentioned kind of like all those different jurisdictions, all these different labor laws, all these different implications. Let's kind of double click on the UAE for a second. I know you've done a lot of training for HR professionals in the Middle East. What are some of the biggest learning curves that you see for HR people who need to kind of get to grips with the UAE as an employment market from scratch?
Well, I guess it would probably mirror my own kind of knowledge. We do deliver a lot of training for HR, and we always focus on, at the beginning, understanding that legal framework that I talked about earlier, the kind of mainland versus free zone arrangement. I think it's important for HR professionals to first be aware of whether or where their organization is, and understanding which law applies. So is it UAE federal labour law, or is it going to be a specific regulation for one of the free zones, or both, if it's a commercial free zone and labour law, and just understanding how the law where their business is operating will impact your employment contracts, terminations, absences, dispute resolution, and just making sure that you don't fall foul of that. It's not uncommon to have, say, a DIFC, so that's Dubai International Financial Centre client, bring us their contracts, and actually it's littered with references to the federal labour law, which is completely irrelevant and not appropriate. So that's always the kind of focus point as a starter for an HR practitioner looking to manage employees in the region or in the UAE. Then, I mean, I suppose we've talked about cultural sensitivity and that diversity management. So again, we often talk about the business environment, but also understanding, Islamic traditions and customs and culture, and just understanding as an HR professional that you'll need to be, aligned or alive to the need to foster a work environment that does respect cultural sensitivities, differences, and understanding local customs, holidays, and traditions, like Ramadan and working patterns that come into force during that time. I suppose employment benefits are another area that HR needs to get a firm understanding of. The UAE is quite competitive, and obviously one of the key attractions for many employees is the lack of income tax at the moment. So understanding what other benefits within the kind of remuneration structure there are, in addition to basic salary. So, and of course, some of those are statutory, so they're mandated by law. So understanding, for example, that you need to provide health insurance, a minimum level of private health insurance. And then there are kind of market-based benefits that you might offer, and understanding what is common, and what's going to retain your employees. So things like housing allowance and education benefits for employees' children. And of course, with such a predominant expat workforce, flights home at least once a year is pretty, well, it's considered pretty necessary for retention, unless it's made up in some other way. So I think getting to grips with that. It'd be remiss of me to talk about benefits without talking about end of service gratuity, which is a statutory entitlement paid to employees on termination, if they're eligible, except in the DIFC. So that's the Dubai International Financial Centre, where you've got this slightly different arrangement, which is called DUE. So that's an employee workplace savings scheme. But HR teams generally need to be prepared to understand how to calculate the benefits under these different schemes, or how to operate them, what the administrative requirements are going to be, and just kind of, I suppose, payroll requirements more generally. So you also have in most of the UAE, so excluding the DIFC, excluding the ADGM, those common law, the financial free zones, but under the let's call it mainland or onshore areas, and in some of the free zone areas, you've also got what we call the wage protection system, which is a kind of digital transfer system to ensure timely salary payments are made, and making sure that employers are paying what they have contracted to pay their employees. I mean, they're probably the main things. I think, that in recent years, the UAE has been pretty active in updating labour law. So there's a lot that's going on, that's been changing. So yeah, it's a challenge for HR everywhere to keep up to date with employment laws, and that is no different here in the UAE. You've got to really be prepared to keep up to date. And as I alluded to, I think a bit earlier on, about kind of being able to draw on my experience in the UK to kind of fill in some lacunas. There are some grey areas in the UAE, and so you need to be prepared to understand, what's gone before, what's coming up, what's changing, and just understanding. Okay, there's black letter, and there's also how things are done, whether that's before the courts or dealing with the HR ministry. Um, but there are just an array of changes to the local regime that HR will need to keep track of. So, in recent years, we've seen changes to anti-discrimination legislation and equal pay initiatives, improvements in terms of family-friendly rights, maternity, parental leave policies, changes to dispute resolution procedures. There's so much more. And also immigration and visa requirements are constantly changing, almost day to day. And so I think HR really needs to understand how integral that visa residency system is to employing people here, and understanding how that changes, and really how that impacts not only onboarding but termination. And sometimes employers can come a cropper because they don't quite understand what is expected of them and what the timescales are, whether it's cancelling visas, or making other changes on that theme.
That's super interesting. So it sounds like what we're saying here is like this is a really attractive market to employ in for various different reasons. But don't fall into the trap of thinking it's really simple, because actually, by my kind of count here, it's actually you need to be aware of three different, almost like completely different areas and different employment sets of employment laws. And actually, because you've got the federal laws, you've got the DIFC, and you've got the ADGM.
Yeah.
Interestingly, on Friday evening, very timely, one of my clients was asking me, do people typically offer different benefits to people in the ADGM versus the DIFC? I thought that was a really good question. You're speaking to you on Monday morning. But I won't put you on the spot for that one. But what are the key differences that people need to be aware of between the DIFC and ADGM and the federal laws? And like, do they ever? It sounds like they conflict sometimes, right? And sometimes you said you have these employment contracts where actually they're talking about federal law, but doesn't apply to the ADGM region, and probably vice versa. So what's your perspective on that? How can that influence strategies?
You're right. There are some fairly significant differences, and it's interesting because things are constantly changing. And on the just on the same vein, somebody was asking me on Friday about the limitation period. So how long do employees have to bring claims? And this is in the mainland or federal law. And until very recently, it was 1 year. It's just changed. It doubled to 2 years. So that's just an indication of how things can change fairly significantly, and are constantly evolving. But yes, some fairly key differences between the legal systems, and particularly between labour law, and DIFC and ADGM. Yes, DIFC and ADGM are kind of cousins because they're both they operate under a common law system, which will be familiar in terms of principles for those who come from common law jurisdictions, as distinct from the UAE federal labour law, which is based on civil law, and Islamic principles in some respects. Both DIFC and ADGM have their independent court systems and their own employment laws. I would say they're largely inspired by English law. So anyone like me with an English or UK legal background will recognise some language and principles that are pretty similar to the UK's Employment Rights Act and the Equality Act. And I think that difference fundamentally affects how we approach employment law matters here. In terms of my work, we've, as a team, focused on advising companies on compliance with DIFC or ADGM law, representing them in the courts. And that's been familiar from the outset because it follows fairly familiar procedural standards as in English courts. They allow for oral evidence, case management practices are fairly similar in terms of disclosing documents and laws around without prejudice conversations and communications. So that environment can feel quite predictable and a bit more transparent for certain foreign businesses, and perhaps contrasts with quite significantly with the more document heavy, document reliant UAE federal courts, where UAE labour law litigation would be undertaken. And there you'll have, in some cases, experts appointed by the court to determine certain elements of a case. And of course, the main difference is that onshore UAE labour law cases are conducted in Arabic, whereas in the ADGM and DIFC, they're conducted in English. And, both the regulatory landscape is evolving in all of those locations continually. And certainly in the time I've been here, I've seen, 3-4 changes. The DIFC introduced a new employment law in 2019. And then another shift came in 2020 where they launched the DIFC employee workplace savings scheme, dues, and that replaced the end of service gratuity scheme that I talked about before, with this more flexible funded savings scheme. It's a bit more like a pension scheme that you might be used to in other parts of the world. And that was a fairly significant reform, seen as kind of modernizing the benefit system. The ADGM has recently completed a consultation over the summer 2024, and that's aligning some of its regulations more closely with DIFC and in some respects with the labour law. So we might see that implemented fairly soon in 2024, 2025. So yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, keeping on track with those changes again is pretty essential. In some ways, both the DIFC and ADGM offer perhaps some higher standards for employees. Certainly much clearer provisions on discrimination, data protection, and possibly some of the other family-friendly rights. And I think we've seen certainly an increase in litigation in certain areas, more so in DIFC and ADGM, perhaps because of the clarity around things like the enforcement of post-termination restrictions and discrimination law. And actually, we've seen recent case, the first judgment in the DIFC courts in October 2024, which was a case involving Standard Chartered Bank, where the DIFC court dealt with allegations of discrimination based on race and nationality. So we are seeing courts more ready to, or I suppose individuals and companies more ready to test out the law in some of these areas. And I think perhaps could lead to a rise in litigation around these areas. So that's why it's important for HR to kind of keep track of all the changes that are happening, both not just in the labour law, but also in ADGM and in the DIFC.
Yeah, makes total sense. So, Emily, how would you kind of characterize the regulatory environment in the UAE at the moment? Would you say there are some pieces of legislation that are, enhancing dispute resolutions for employees? Is this a country that's now becoming more employee friendly? Do you think that's an accurate summary, or am I being a bit too simplistic?
I think you're right in some respects. I would say the regulatory environment in terms of employment has seen some shifts to give more protection for employees, particular changes focused in the federal labour law. So that applies to mainland UAE, but not to the common law free zones, DIFC or ADGM. So in particular, I have in mind there have been some notable changes aimed at supporting employees' ability to enforce their rights. As I mentioned, that recent change from the summer of 2024, which has extended the time limit for filing labour claims to from 1 year to 2 years. And then we've also seen an increase in penalties for non-compliance. And just again, that simplification, I suppose, speed of justice. So the HR ministry is now able to issue decisions on some smaller claims. So anything that's up to a value of 50,000 dirhams. So you're seeing a streamlining of that dispute resolution, just making it a bit more easier for employees to bring their cases to bear. So yes, I think that does suggest an employee-friendly environment, but I would always argue that there's a trade-off, and there has been a historic um, sense that the UAE is more employee-friendly when it comes to employment. But I actually think, particularly in terms of the UAE labour law, which was quite significantly overhauled in 2022, that some of those adjustments actually significantly eroded quite key protections around termination of employment for certain employees, which means that actually employers have much more flexibility to terminate employees, and has probably introduced quite a bit of ambiguity and possibly weakened security for employees. In some respects, I shouldn't be flagging that so much, because then employers won't need us so much. But it's interesting to see that kind of sense persist of the UAE being employee friendly. I do think there have been some changes to move the UAE to more balanced, employee friendly, but also maintaining some flexibility and a competitive environment for employers to operate in. So it actually a dual focus.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there's so much going on here, right? There's the growth of the market. There's the focus on Emiratisation. There's the work permit piece that's also ongoing here. There's the cultural shifts, as you say, and then all of these changes can be really significant. Like the employment law being overhauled in 2022. That's only 2 years ago.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to see all these different aspects of like what we do colliding in this one place. Seems really, really interesting. One other area I wanted to pick your brains on was the alternative EOSB scheme. I think that's another important development that's showing how countries seem to be tightening or enhancing their rules around pensions and end of service benefits. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yes, of course. So the EOSB, I should get that right, is the end of service benefit, or it may be called EOSG, end of service gratuity, or gratuity. Basically, it's a statutory payment that's paid to employees in the UAE, and actually common in the wider Gulf Middle East region. It's a statutory payment paid at the end of employment as a form of severance. Some might consider it a kind of retirement contribution benefit. And that's paid calculated based on final salary, final basic salary, length of service. And so it's quite different to a traditional pension where you have contributions made and invested over time. But yes, as you said, there have been some interesting developments around alternatives to that. So I mentioned in the DIFC that you have the Employee Workplace Savings Plan or scheme, which replaced the end of service benefit in the DIFC in 2020. And that plan is mandatory for DIFC companies and employees. And that's a contribution-based alternative to gratuity or ESOB. And that's specifically for DIFC employers. So with dues, employers contribute regularly to a professionally managed fund throughout an employee's tenure. Now, outside DIFC, you still have the gratuity scheme or EOSB. And in addition to that, there is now an optional alternative scheme in the UAE outside of DIFC and ADGM. And that allows employers to provide and secure retirement savings in a very similar way to dues. So that is an additional scheme. So it's as the title indicates, it's an optional alternative end of service benefit scheme. So it's not mandatory yet. I'm speculating about the yet, but the pretty firm expectation is that this will eventually be rolled out on a federal level, just to ensure a more sustainable um, and secure retirement savings. We've seen so much litigation and dispute around payment of end of service gratuity, the statutory payment. And there have been some changes to how it's calculated and the entitlement over the years. For example, it could be reduced if the employee resigned over a period of time. It could be it could be there could be a disentitlement to the benefit if the employee was terminated for misconduct, for certain misconduct. Um, so kind of over time removing some of the uncertainty, because the whole point of it is to provide some kind of independent savings and secure savings. So that's why there's a fairly clear expectation that it will eventually be rolled out at a federal level. So for HR professionals and employers looking to move into the region, even those that are here, it's definitely an area of really keen interest as those new schemes become available. And there are a plethora of um, potential providers who will be looking to get their scheme on the market. So eventually, as an HR manager or director, you'll eventually need to be thinking about how best to offer those benefits, which scheme best meets your business's long-term financial goals, how to roll out that strategy. There'll be an employee education piece around that, potentially also some contractual arrangements or amendments to be made. So, yeah, the UAE is kind of exploring modernizing savings and employee benefits in that way. So, quite a significant shift we're seeing just in terms of helping employees with financial planning and financial retirement benefits.
Yeah, that is really interesting to see that evolving.
Mm.
I know we're kind of committed to time. There's a few more questions I wanted to pick your brains on. A bit earlier on, you talked a bit about data protection laws in the context of those different sub-regions or sub-regions within the UAE. I was curious to get your take on how these issues were evolving in the Middle East and in particular in the UAE.
Yeah, I think uh, data protection and privacy have become big topics in the Middle East, particularly in the last 5 to 6 years. And obviously, my focus is on the employment side, to helping companies to set up practices that meet any local requirements and international standards in terms of their employment arrangements. Um, and I mean, data protection laws have been around for a while in various guises. Um, in the DIFC, where we're based, data protection legislation has been around for many years, but it was really strengthened with the updated law in 2020. And that law kind of built on the existing framework and added in some global standards, obviously drawing upon the GDPR, and introducing some key aspects around data subject rights, clarification around lawful processing, and when you have the grounds to process, and how to manage data transfers to other jurisdictions. So really, when that came in, we've been helping employers update employment contracts, draft employee privacy statements, and developing employment data protection policies. We also get involved in data subject access requests, or DSARs, which is when employees want to see what personal data their employers hold on them. It's not something I've really seen a lot of in the region, but I think it's increasing now as greater awareness is made of data protection laws, particularly when there are disputes or performance reviews, and employees have become more aware of their rights. The ADGM also has a dedicated a general data protection law, which again aligns with international law norms. The UAE also introduced a federal data protection law. However, to the frustration of some, we are still waiting for specific regulations, and we're expecting a data protection office to be established which would handle enforcement and queries. So a little bit of uncertainty, but nevertheless, companies are still preparing for compliance, regardless of kind of anything that needs to be completed on that front. And a lot of my clients um, have international partners, or they have global operations, so they're looking already to, perhaps to GDPR or other global international frameworks as kind of their gold standard. And so, following those principles to manage cross-border processing um, actually helps build trust not only with their business partners but also employees. So, um, it does come up in various areas here. We've been asked recently to, advise on retention schedules. And actually, the DIFC law, for example, does dictate certain um, retention periods for certain employment records. So HR teams do still need to have an understanding of data protection in the region. And I think overall, just the region is moving towards more global data protection standards. I know Saudi Arabia has introduced fairly stringent requirements, and companies will be needing to put kind of fairly solid, perhaps GDPR type aligned policies in place. And it's certainly to be an area to be focused on as these new regulations kind of continue to be rolled out in the region.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's good. It's interesting to see that like there's that. Hopefully, we get to a world at some point in the future where everything becomes like there's a standard, there's a global standard that everyone kind of points to and agrees to. But yeah, it's interesting to see that things are evolving quite rapidly over there.
Definitely.
There's a couple of final questions I just wanted to get your perspective on. We talked a bit earlier on about cross-border or cross-border employment laws. I wanted to get your take on um, M&A transactions in particular, and when companies are going through mergers or acquisitions in the UAE, what are some of the key things that they need to be thinking about when they go through those transitions to make sure that this is as smooth and as simple as possible for them and for their employees?
It's a good question, actually. And as you were saying it, I was thinking, there's when we talked about what do HR need to know. Obviously, we usually your first thought is to the onboarding. So how do we get people on the ground? But actually, also need to think about what happens when you're acquiring businesses and employees. And one of the key differences for me, certainly moving from the UK, was understanding in the context of an M&A deal that there's no automatic transfer principle. So you don't automatically get employees moving from one entity to the new entity on their existing terms, as you might be familiar with in the UK and in the EU more generally. And actually here, when if you're buying a business, transferring employees actually requires their current contracts to be terminated. So that includes settling final payments, end of service benefits, and then you need to rehire them under new contracts with the acquiring company. So that actually means managing the arrangement of new work permits and new visas, and that's all going to take time. So it's just another element of planning when it comes to um, acquiring another business. So something that you need to plan ahead, and a key area. Um, and in particular, that piece around the end of service benefit and how to pay that out, because since your employment is technically terminated, the end of service benefit becomes due at that point. So you've crystallized that right. So in M&A situations, there's always a conversation, or typically is a conversation, about how we deal with that. Do you decide to pay it out at completion, or is there some arrangement, some negotiation, discussion around carrying it forward under the new employment arrangement, and there being a promise that the acquiring company pays it out at some point in the future? And that's just something that needs to be agreed up front, in my opinion, just to ensure a pretty smooth, or a smooth a transition as you can have. I think in terms of the due diligence in deals here, it's pretty similar to what you would do globally. Um, I'd say in the UAE, cross-border or dual employment issues do come up quite a bit. And I think it's quite common to see that employees might have employment rights in multiple jurisdictions. So, as I mentioned before, if they've been seconded or there are dual contracts, and that can be something that can be quite complex to manage. So, it does tend to get flushed out during acquisitions, and is something that needs to be addressed at that point to avoid future complications and to settle any arrangements. So yeah, I think just there are um, some particular uh, tweaks to the process that you would usually follow in an acquisition somewhere else when you're dealing with employees here in the UAE.
Yeah, makes sense. And not only, so I guess if you're going through one of these situations right now, not only do you have basically three different jurisdictions of ADGM, DIFC, and the federal law to accommodate, you've got to get up to speed with all of those things at
Well,
once. You also have a lack of a transfer, an automated transfer process. So
yeah,
that's something you need to navigate, as well as for an extra cherry on the top, you've also got to figure out the work permit situation to make sure you can get those quickly and ensure a smooth transition. So it sounds like a really simple task for somebody who's going through that at the moment, right? Um,
that's it.
Perfect. Emily, this has been so insightful for me. I've learned loads today. To be honest, you've enlightened me on some of the areas I hadn't even factored into, that are kind of creating this real hub of excitement and change and all the different things that are going on here. Before we close out, I just wanted to get from you, what would your top tips be for a company building their workforce in the UAE for the first time right now?
So this might come across as a bit of a plug, but I think your first thing is to make sure you're consulting with local experts. I mean, that's not necessarily legal professionals; could be HR consultants, immigration advisors. You need people to make sure you have the help to navigate the complexities of what we've just been discussing, whether it's the labor laws, employment laws, regulations, the visa situation, onboarding, and just getting the right advice is important for getting compliant and having that sustainable practices in place. Um, just be flexible. Uh, we've just barely scratched the surface. I think the UAE is really evolving quickly in this market in terms of employment developments. And every week there is something different and new. One thing we were talking about over the summer is how the UAE have developed this kind of work in UAE platform, which is meant to be a one-stop shop for employee onboarding. And it's just kind of a focus on what just brings to into focus how important it is to be able to streamline the hiring process, because you are managing expatriates and having to manage documentation, whether it's getting the visas and therefore having to get your employees professional qualification and education certificates and making sure the documentation is in one place. So um, I think being adaptable and being able to navigate a quickly evolving landscape is important. And of course, I have to say, I think partnering with an employer of record can be a smart move on that. So again, a plug for you guys, but if people don't have a local HR presence and not familiar with the local landscape, then having someone who can kind of take a lot of that compliance and the logistical details and having that kind of streamlined onboarding process is just going to be a no-brainer, just to allow you to focus on growing your business. And then as time moves on and you get familiar with the landscape, you've got time to then understand and manage some of that yourself.
I couldn't agree more. But to underpin, I think your first point was really sound. It seems like, people will often overlook how complex this country is. And it's almost like three different countries in one in certain ways. And
That's
so,
it.
yeah, definitely
Yeah.
speak, regardless of your employment model, like, definitely worth speaking to an expert before you go jumping in with both feet. Emily, thank you so much for being on the Global Workforce podcast today. It's been an absolute pleasure and I've learned a huge amount and I'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Likewise. Thank you for having me on.
Cheers.